She booked the first class, paid nearly $2,000 to arrive on time for a board meeting that could change the future of an entire airline. But when she politely asked about her dinner selection, the flight attendant looked her up and down and said, "Economy passengers don't get to choose meals, ma'am." They saw the simple coat, the lack of makeup, and assumed she didn't belong. What they didn't know was that the woman in seat 2A had just secured a 28% stake in the very airline they worked for. And this time, she wasn't staying silent. Vanessa Boyd, a 39-year-old African-American CEO of Crescent Partners, a multinational investment firm, was en route from Denver to Seattle on a Pacific Eagle Airlines flight. Her mission: finalize a critical acquisition that would bring the struggling airline into Crescent's portfolio. Dressed casually, with no entourage, she intended to travel unnoticed. But the moment she stepped onto the plane, she became the target of a quiet, cutting form of discrimination, one that would turn a routine flight into a defining moment of reckoning. The plane had barely leveled off when Vanessa noticed the first sign. Linda, the lead flight attendant, moved briskly down the aisle, handing printed menus to passengers in first class, but skipped right past her. Vanessa, seated in 2A, raised her hand politely and asked if she could see the menu, noting she had pre-selected her entree during booking. Linda didn't smile. Her expression was clipped, professional in the coldest sense. "Your seat's probably an upgrade from economy, right? We're out of entree options, only sandwiches left." Vanessa blinked. Calmly, she opened her travel app and held up her first-class booking confirmation. Linda barely glanced at the screen before walking away without another word. The man seated in 2B looked over with mild confusion, sensing something wasn't quite right. A woman across the aisle raised an eyebrow. No one spoke, but the mood had shifted. One of those subtle, shared silences that stretch longer than they should. Moments later, when Vanessa pressed the call button for a glass of sparkling water, a different crew member arrived. His name tag read Carter. He didn't greet her, didn't ask what she needed. "Yes," he muttered, tone flat. When she asked for water with lemon, he handed her a small plastic cup without looking at her, muttered, "Sure thing, sweetheart," and walked off with a smirk. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them, like he was doing her a favor. Vanessa sat still. She didn't react, didn't flinch. She simply reached for her phone and opened a new note, calmly recording the interaction. 6:23 p.m., skipped for the menu, denied entree, condescending tone, addressed as sweetheart. Her fingers tapped with precision, not emotion. This wasn't new. She had faced polished microaggressions in high-end boardrooms and casual dismissals at executive retreats. But never quite like this, so public, so small, yet searing. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but everything around her seemed just a little too quiet. No one was watching her outright, but she could feel it. An unease hanging in the air like static before a storm. Every movement of the crew now felt rehearsed, sterile. Vanessa adjusted her posture, smoothed the crease in her charcoal slacks, and folded her hands. If this was how they treated her in first class, she wondered, how did they treat passengers with no voice, no visibility? She wasn't angry, yet. She was taking inventory, and as the cabin cruised at 36,000 feet towards Seattle, Vanessa Boyd began collecting more than just data. She was collecting proof. Because one thing she knew from years in finance, when the numbers tell a pattern, you follow it. And the pattern here was crystal clear. She didn't look like what they expected in seat 2A, and that, apparently, was enough to make her invisible. But she knew better than to raise her voice in the moment. Power, after all, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it watches and waits. 45 minutes into the flight, Vanessa looked up just in time to see Linda placing a perfectly plated steak dinner in front of the man in 2C, a passenger who had just switched into the seat from further back. He smiled and thanked her, clearly surprised by the upgrade. Vanessa, composed but firm, turned to Linda as she passed and said, "Excuse me, I was told there were no entrees left. I see one was just served." Linda didn't flinch. She didn't even bother to lower her voice. "That gentleman is on the priority list," she said curtly, glancing down at her tablet. "You're not." The words landed sharp and final. Vanessa nodded once, her face unreadable. Across the aisle, an older woman leaned in and whispered, "Are you all right?" Vanessa responded with a soft smile. "I'm fine," she said quietly, "but they won't be." With that, she picked up her phone, opened her secure messaging app, and fired off 2 messages. One to Celeste, her legal counsel. "Verify full crew manifest for flight PE 471, begin internal documentation." And another to Jordan, Crescent's head of communications. "After landing, I want all media statements to come through me. No one else speaks until I say so." There was no emotion in her typing, only precision. A few rows back, a younger man she hadn't noticed earlier caught her eye and gestured subtly. He showed her a video on his phone. Linda brushing her off while serving another passenger. He'd recorded the entire interaction. Vanessa accepted the airdrop with a nod and a quiet, "Thank you." The flight continued, but something in the energy had shifted. The once muted tension now simmered just beneath the surface. Linda and Carter passed her seat with studied indifference, avoiding eye contact as if nothing had happened, as if the cabin wasn't watching now. But Vanessa wasn't reacting anymore. She was building. Every slight, every phrase, every recorded moment became data. And where some might have unraveled, she centered. For years she had walked into mergers knowing which numbers mattered. Now she knew exactly which truths needed to be spotlighted. She didn't need confrontation mid-air, she needed accountability on the ground. Quietly, she opened a folder on her phone labeled Incident Response, Tier 2. In it were pre-drafted memos, escalation plans, and communication protocols. She didn't need to improvise, she was always ready. And as she sat there in seat 2A, sipping the warm water she hadn't asked for, Vanessa Boyd wasn't simply enduring the moment. She was transforming it. Her silence didn't surrender. It was a strategy. Because while some people responded to injustice with anger, Vanessa had learned to answer with structure. She didn't just want an apology, she wanted a culture shift. And before this plane even touched the Seattle runway, she had already begun orchestrating a reckoning that would leave no doubt about who truly belonged in first class. As soon as flight PE 471 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International, Vanessa remained seated, letting the other passengers disembark first while calmly gathering her belongings. She didn't rush, she didn't need to. Every second that passed was another step toward accountability. Once off the plane, she bypassed the baggage claim and headed straight to the Pacific Eagle Airlines VIP lounge, where she requested an immediate meeting with the ground operations supervisor. A young manager named Elise met her in a glass-walled conference room tucked behind the concierge desk. Vanessa laid her leather portfolio on the table, opened it with precision, and began presenting her case. Not emotionally, but factually. Booking confirmation, digital boarding pass, seating map, time-stamped video of Linda denying her a meal. The air-dropped clip showing another passenger receiving the entree she'd been told was unavailable. Witness statements, every detail catalogued and time-stamped. Elise, visibly uncomfortable, shifted in her seat and tried to soften the impact. "Ms. Boyd, I understand how upsetting this may have felt. It's possible there was some miscommunication in our onboard process." Vanessa didn't let her finish. Her voice was calm, steady, surgical. "There was no miscommunication. A black woman in a wool coat asked for the meal she paid for, and your staff decided she didn't qualify. I was profiled, dismissed, and humiliated in your flagship cabin. That's not a service issue. That's a culture issue." She reached into her bag and pulled out a second folder, this one marked with the Crescent Partners seal. She slid it across the table to Elise. Inside was a signed letter of intent confirming Crescent's pending acquisition of a 28% ownership stake in Pacific Eagle Airlines. Vanessa paused, allowing Elise to absorb the weight of what she was looking at. "I was on that flight not just as a passenger, but as a primary investor," Vanessa said, "and now I'm reconsidering that position. Not because of inconvenience, but because of institutional behavior." With that, she tapped her phone and sent an email addressed directly to the CEO of Pacific Eagle. Attached were all the files, links to the video evidence, statements from passengers, and a formal complaint logged through her legal team. Seconds later, the internal comms team at Pacific Eagle received a notification from Crescent's corporate office. "Effective immediately, Crescent Partners will initiate a full corporate culture audit of Pacific Eagle Airlines. This process begins with a comprehensive review of in-flight operations and conduct, starting with Flight PE471. The timing wasn't coincidental. Vanessa had synced the email with a scheduled internal bulletin to ensure the story broke first within the company. Before it hit external media, her voice never rose. She didn't demand compensation, didn't threaten lawsuits. Instead, she dismantled their defense with facts, with structure, and with the kind of unshakable calm that only comes from knowing exactly where you stand. The ground crew, now alerted to the situation's gravity, began scrambling to respond, but Vanessa had already stood, gathered her folder, and exited the lounge. The statement had been made. The facts were undeniable. And by the time she stepped into her waiting car outside the terminal, the question wasn't whether Pacific Eagle would act. It was how quickly they could clean up a mess that had been brewing long before Vanessa Boyd ever took seat 2A. By the following morning, the ripple effects of Vanessa's quiet but calculated stand had become impossible to contain. Pacific Eagle Airlines issued an internal notice at 7 a.m., suspending the entire flight crew of PE471 pending a full investigation. Linda and Carter, the two crew members at the center of the incident, were placed on administrative leave and marked for internal review under Pacific Eagle's anti-discrimination policies, a process typically used sparingly, but now fast-tracked under executive pressure. The airline's internal HR portal flashed a mandatory company-wide update. All in-flight staff, customer-facing employees, and supervisors were required to complete an accelerated training module on anti-bias, racial sensitivity, and passenger dignity protocols within the next 14 days. In a hastily scheduled press conference later that afternoon, Pacific Eagle's CEO, Ronald McKay, stood stiffly at a podium surrounded by a wall of reporters. On behalf of Pacific Eagle Airlines, he read, "We extend our deepest apologies to Ms. Vanessa Boyd and all passengers who witnessed the unacceptable conduct on board Flight PE471. This incident does not reflect the values of our company or the future we aim to build." His tone was solemn but unmistakably rehearsed, a man trying to patch a sinking boat while cameras rolled. When asked by a reporter whether the incident would impact the pending investment deal with Crescent Partners, McKay shifted uncomfortably before responding, "We are in active dialogue with Crescent leadership and remain committed to addressing their concerns." Behind the scenes, that dialogue had already taken place. At 10:30 a.m. that same day, Vanessa walked into a high-level board meeting with Pacific's executive team. She was calm, composed, and clear. She laid out a revised investment framework. Crescent would proceed with the $280 million capital injection, but with new terms. Over the next 3 years, Crescent would implement a cultural oversight committee within Pacific Eagle, with quarterly reporting requirements, internal climate surveys, and direct review over training and hiring practices. A new vice president of ethics and compliance would be jointly appointed by both Crescent and Pacific leadership, and future executive bonuses would be tied in part to progress on diversity benchmarks. Some board members flinched at the conditions, but no one spoke against them. They knew the damage to their reputation was already front-page news. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, her voice firm yet measured. "We will still invest," she said, "but only in a company that can admit when it's wrong and has the courage to change." The room was silent. Even those who had initially dismissed the flight incident as minor now understood its weight. Vanessa wasn't demanding retribution. She was requiring reform, and by framing the investment as a partnership for accountability, not punishment, she made it clear that Crescent wasn't walking away, it was stepping in. The deal moved forward that afternoon with a unanimous board vote. The dollar amount stayed the same, but the message had changed completely. This wasn't just capital, it was cultural leverage. And for Pacific Eagle Airlines, keeping the investment meant opening the doors to a future that could no longer be built on silence, dismissal, or assumptions made in aisle seats and galleys. The reckoning had begun, and it was being led not with outrage, but with structure, vision, and power that didn't need to shout to be heard. 3 months later, Vanessa Boyd stood under the soft lights of a Pacific Eagle Airlines press conference, this time not as a passenger, but as an honored guest. The event marked the official launch of the airline's new FlyFair initiative, a sweeping equity and inclusion program born out of both public scrutiny and internal reckoning. The stage had been set with careful precision, sleek branding, a diverse panel of speakers, and rows of reporters ready to broadcast the airline's shift toward accountability. When Vanessa took the podium, she didn't mention the flight number. She didn't need to. The room already knew. With quiet poise, she looked out at the sea of faces. Executives, journalists, crew members, even former critics, and said, "Not everyone who stays silent is weak. Some people stay silent because they're waiting for the right moment. And when that moment comes, their words don't just reclaim a meal, they reclaim respect for an entire generation." The room held its breath. Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. No theatrics, no blame, just clarity, just truth. A few in the audience clapped softly at first, then others joined until the room filled with applause that felt more like recognition than celebration. Vanessa stepped down from the stage without fanfare, returning to her seat next to the newly appointed VP of Ethics, who had been chosen with Crescent's oversight. The brand-new cultural audit system had already begun its first phase, with quarterly reports made public and anonymous employee feedback channels now mandatory. The flight crew from PE 471 had been officially dismissed, but more importantly, dozens of staff from across departments had stepped forward with stories of their own, stories now being heard, documented, and acted upon. For Vanessa, the moment wasn't about victory, it was about validation. She hadn't demanded an apology, she'd engineered a structural transformation. And in doing so, she reminded the industry that respect isn't a bonus feature of service. It's the foundation. Power doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks quietly in a plain coat and takes note of everything. Vanessa's story is a reminder that leadership is not about control. It's about clarity, courage, and timing. Just because someone is soft-spoken doesn't mean they're unprepared. In fact, true leaders often wait for the moment when their voice will echo farthest. We live in a world where people are often judged by appearances, by clothing, accent, or skin tone. But leadership must start by seeing people, not profiles. Discrimination doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through tone, omission, or convenience. But its impact is just as lasting. A single moment, being denied a meal, could have been brushed off. Vanessa didn't. Because she knew what was truly at stake wasn't dinner. It was dignity. And when dignity is denied, accountability must follow. For businesses, this is a wake-up call. Culture is not shaped by slogans, but by behavior. One misstep by an employee can cost millions in brand damage. But handled right, it can also lead to real growth. For individuals, the lesson is just as clear. You don't have to yell to be powerful. You just have to act when it counts. And finally, for every person who has ever been looked over, spoken down to, or told they don't belong, remember this: a seat, a title, a uniform. None of those define your worth. The way you stand in the face of injustice does. Vanessa Boyd didn't just change a flight, she helped reset an entire company's compass. And that kind of legacy doesn't come from loud outrage. It comes from strategic grace. If you believe that a single story can spark real change, subscribe to our channel and be part of something bigger. Every week, we bring you stories like Vanessa Boyd's, narratives that expose injustice, spotlight courage, and remind us that silence doesn't mean surrender. These aren't just tales of adversity, they're blueprints for transformation. Whether it's a quiet act of resistance, a strategic stand in the boardroom, or a moment of dignity reclaimed at 30,000 feet, these stories show that power comes in many forms, and sometimes it begins with one person simply refusing to be erased. We share these journeys not just to inform, but to empower, because somewhere out there, someone is experiencing the same microaggressions, the same systemic neglect, the same doubt. And they need to know they're not alone. They need to know that someone spoke up and changed the system. If that message resonates with you, don't just watch, subscribe. Join a growing community that values respect, accountability, and the quiet strength of those who fight for justice without ever raising their voice. Hit that button and let's keep telling the stories that move us forward. One flight, one voice, and one truth at a time.